Good morning, Legacy Bible Church. Thank you for joining us. We have a little bit of a shorter teaching today. Stephen has been in the book of James for his class at Southwest Baptist Theological Seminary, and he is writing his research paper on that right now. And he is going to come in and talk to you, give you a brief overview about the book of James, and then he's going to continue teaching on that when we join you for our weekly teaching. So I am excited to have him come up here and talk about that. And also, I had been teaching on the 42 different areas that are referencing spiritually spoken worship in the book of Romans. Now, I haven't done that for a little bit of time, and it won't be next week, but the week after that, we'll be back and look at the different ways that spiritually spoken worship is being referenced, not with those exact words, but we're speaking in tongues and worshiping in spirit and truth. I'm just giving you different names for it, but then there's also more obscure areas than that. But it has been an exciting area for me to teach on, and anytime you get up to teach, you just learn so much more, and it's like a fire hose as I try and digest everything that I'm reading that from his commentary in order to teach to you in 5 or 10 minutes a concept of spiritually spoken worship in the book of Romans. But we'll be back with that in 2 weeks. Thank you for joining us, and Steve's going to come up here and teach on the book of James.
Well, good morning, Legacy Bible Church, and thank you for that introduction, Robin. And I'd look forward, Robin, getting back into the book of Romans and the various references that Paul makes to spiritually spoken worship. And that is the one thing, church. The New Testament documents are all focused on that, including James. I'm going to explain that as I walk through James over the coming weeks, that James, the brother of the Lord, is a practicer of worship and spiritually spoken worship, but he had a particular view of it. And so I'm going to give an overview of that today. And I'm hoping that it'll be somewhat brief, but as these things go, they are actually very convoluted when you get into the historical picture. It's not clear and crisp and clean. But it's important to have an overview of this convoluted history that we have in Christianity. And the book of James is actually very central in that history. Why? Because James, the brother of the Lord, who wrote the book of James, was a central player in that early controversy. And because of that early controversy and the dynamics of the controversy, James has had a very convoluted history in the history of the church, a very convoluted history of how it's been viewed, how it's been used in the history of the church, right up till this present day. And so what I want to do today is present this umbrella overview of the history of the book of James. And I call it, if you read the page on today's teaching, a conundrum of traditions. And that's about the only way you can explain James in 2 or 3 words over the history of the church, is that James has been part and parcel to a conundrum of traditions. So James has been interpreted many different ways, has gone through ebbs and tides where James is accepted and revered, and then long seasons where he's not revered, and then there's a resurgence or a regeneration of interest in James, and so it's just been kind of an ebb and tide throughout history. And that's kind of the picture that I want to paint for you today, so that as we're studying James, I don't want to have to repeat these things ad nauseum, because then it will detract from the specific teaching of the text. And so I'm going to talk about that history today, And then when I teach in the text of the book of James in the coming weeks, I can refer to this teaching, a conundrum of traditions, and refer you back to it and not have to repeat ad nauseum and take up a lot of time when I'm just teaching on the text. First and foremost, and this is not new to those of you that have been with us at Legacy Bible Church for some time, but first and foremost, James was part of a very early controversy in the church where two traditions evolved in the early church. Not evolved. There was the one tradition that was given through the cross, what Irenaeus at the end of the 2nd century, looking back, called the ancient tradition of the apostles. It's represented by the New Testament documents, all of them, including the book of James, albeit James, I'll just say in a nutshell, James syncretizes the ancient tradition of the apostles with Moses, with Judaism. So James took Jesus and made it Jesus plus Moses. That's what the book of James, in its original context, in its original purpose, when it was written in AD 48, yes, we can narrow it down that closely. When James wrote in AD 48, he was affirming both the ancient tradition of the apostles, Jesus, and continuity, full continuity into the new covenant age of Moses, of Torah, of the law of Moses, that Jesus didn't end the law of Moses. Jesus, in essence, in James' purview and the interpretation that evolved, that syncretized the ancient tradition with Moses, James and that tradition viewed Christianity, Jesus, as the means to do what the Israelites could never do. They could never really fully keep the law, but Jesus provides the ability. This is the Jamesian view here. Jesus provides the ability that when we're operating in our mind, our flesh, we can fully keep the law, that Jesus enables us to keep the law of Moses. So James is a very hyper continuity syncretization of Christianity with the old covenant law of Moses. So that's the earliest advent. And then James felt the compulsion to write about this syncretized tradition on the heels of Paul's first missionary journey into South Galatia. That was in AD 47. Paul went into South Galatia and taught the full ancient tradition of the apostles, which essentially says that Moses is not, Paul didn't teach Christianity as a negative foil for Moses, as if Moses was something wrong or something bad. Paul taught Jesus as the fulfillment of Moses, that with Jesus, Moses is out of the picture now. Now it's just Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. And so when Paul went into South Galatia, teaching at Antioch of Iconium, and I know he ended at Lystra and Derbe. I was trying to think of the third one that he was at. Anyway, the book of Acts tells us 4 cities that he taught in, and Paul confirms that in one of his pastoral letters. I think it's 2 Timothy. He confirms those same 4 cities that he did his first missionary journey teaching. So Paul went into South Galatia in AD 47 and essentially taught that with Jesus, the law of Moses, the old covenant, has been surpassed. Now it's Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. And he taught in the synagogues. He always went into the synagogue first. So he went into the Jewish synagogues of these cities in what's the hinterland of what I call the hinterland of the Anatolian Peninsula. It's modern day Turkey. It's in central modern day Turkey. And so these synagogues were very tenacious about Moses clinging to the law. That was their identity. So for Paul to come into the synagogues and teach that this Jesus, this Messiah Jesus, who had died on the cross only in 47, that would be 14 years earlier, that Jesus had surpassed Moses, and now Jesus is the object of our worship. Jesus is the object of our salvation. In fact, Jesus is the fulfillment of everything God, the Father, was working toward on behalf of man. Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. Paul went into the synagogue, said, Moses is through, finished. He served his season. His purpose is done. When the Jews put Jesus on the cross, their special purposes in the salvation plan of God was over. And the Jews went up in arms. They that violated everything that they held to in terms of who they were in covenant with the one true living God, and their place in the salvation history of God. Everything Paul went into the synagogues teaching just put them over the edge. In fact, at Lystra, the Jews would stone Paul and leave him for dead. And of course, Paul's the disciples gathered around Paul, prayed over him, and he arose. And you can leave it to debate and interpretation if you want to say, well, he was just knocked unconscious versus, well, they really did kill him and God raised him from the dead. He went back into Lystra and said, it didn't work. Here I am. And he went on to finish his missionary journey in South Galatia, ostensibly without opposition, because you don't really read about it in the book of Acts any more opposition after they stoned Paul. And he revived and he went back into the city of Lystra and showed them, here I am. It didn't work. Are you opposing me, Paul, or are you opposing God? And the Jews did not resist him directly anymore. But here's the likely scenario that did occur. Having stoned Paul for blasphemy against God, message got back to Jerusalem very, very quickly. Why? Because Jerusalem was the center of the world for Judaism and for Christianity, by the way, because Christianity in that day was basically thought of a sect of Judaism. I talked about that this last Wednesday with Sarah. If you want to go look at that at the chat time on Wednesday, we had a discussion about that. Earliest Christianity was not what you have to get yourself out of the modern paradigm where we're basically completely free of the specter of Judaism, and now we're just Christians, right? And back in those earliest days, it wasn't like that. Judaism was still a powerful force, both in and of itself and within the Roman Empire. It was a legal religion in the Roman Empire. They didn't have to do obeisance and worship the emperor because they had a legal right to be Jews, to practice Judaism. And so this is still the day of legalized Judaism. The Jews had not engaged in war against Rome, and Jerusalem had not yet been destroyed. That would come in AD 47. This is still about 25 years prior to that. Okay, so Paul goes into the central part of the Anatolian Peninsula, modern day Turkey. He goes into the synagogues and preaches Moses is over. Now it's just Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. And the Jews are very hostile toward that, to say the least. So they send messengers. Word gets back to Jerusalem that this Apostle Paul used to be a Pharisee, used to be a teacher of Torah, a teacher of Moses, very prominent in Jerusalem. This Paul is going around the nations teaching the Jews to forsake Moses. And so what they would do, the first thing that they would do is go to the ostensible leader of the Christian movement, who happened to also be in Jerusalem. He was James, the brother of the Lord, in AD 47. And he became the leader of the church in Jerusalem only 4 years earlier, when James the apostle was beheaded in Jerusalem. That was in AD 43. Peter was imprisoned, and then Peter was miraculously freed from prison. You know that story. That's only 4 years old. But because of the scattering of the apostles, James, the brother of the Lord, became the de facto leader of the church at Jerusalem, which made James, the brother of the Lord, the de facto leader of the entire Christian movement, right? Because Jerusalem was still the center of the Jewish world. Christianity was still very much a Jew-led religion. And so it was centered at Jerusalem. And the leader of the church at Jerusalem would be viewed as the primary leader, the primary voice of the churches wherever they would be throughout the empire. That was the situation in the mid-40s. James, the brother of the Lord at Jerusalem, is the leader of the church, period. He was viewed that way. That's why, for instance, in AD 49, when they had the Jerusalem council meeting, James was the primary spokesman, the leader of that council meeting at Jerusalem. And when they finished debating, James almost unilaterally rendered the decision that would come out of that council meeting. And James, the brother of the Lord, wrote the letter that would go out and essentially at that point, finally in AD 49, say that, fine, the Gentiles do not have to be circumcised, or certain other requirements they were required to do. Food laws, no fornication, no eating meat sacrificed to idols, things of that nature. But it was silent on circumcision. So by omission, that letter, that note, if you will, because it's much shorter than the letter from James, basically relieved the church of enforcing, requiring circumcision on the Gentiles. But now back up just 2 years, it wasn't that way when Paul went into South Galatia on the first missionary journey. And he was teaching not only the Gentiles don't have to be circumcised, but also that the Jews can basically, I don't want to say forget about Moses, but basically just view Moses as fulfilled, past, surpassed by Jesus Christ. And that was anathema. In AD 47, that put them up in arms. Word got back to Jerusalem. And the chief priests in Jerusalem, hearing this, the first thing they would do is march right down the street, right? Jerusalem wasn't that big of a town. They would march right down the street to James, or summon James to come into their presence. However it happened, we don't know. And would say, James, brother of the Lord, what on God's green earth is this guy, Paul, from your sect, doing in the diaspora, going into synagogues, teaching the synagogues to forsake Moses? What's going on? Explain yourself. And so that would be the situation, the milieu, if you will, that would motivate the letter from James. And I have here my copy of it. It's not a long letter. It's in my transcription here. It's about 6 pages of text in my rendering here. So it's not a long letter, but that is the occasion, if you will, the situation out of which James, the brother of the Lord, wrote the letter from James. Very hostile. The persecution against the apostles when James the apostle was beheaded was only 4 years ago. So think about that in your own context here in 2022. All you have to do is go back to 2018 and say, what was I doing? What was life like in 2018? It's not very long ago. You still have a very vivid memory of the things that happened in 2018. I can tell you some very big things that happened in our life in 2018. And one of them very good, right? And that would be Robin's amazing surgery that she had with a gentleman who we know lovingly as Dr. Wang. Big events that happened in 2018. It's not that long ago. So that's the situation here in 47 AD. Actually, it's only 3 years. It'd be 4 years prior when James the Apostle, or the Apostle James, was beheaded. Just 4 years earlier. So this is the situation in Jerusalem in very late AD 47, maybe into early AD 48, and the situation at Jerusalem between the leaders of the Jews, the chief priesthood and the Sanhedrin, and the leader of this very small fledgling Christian movement, who was James, the brother of the Lord, and he's on the hot seat. And as was demonstrated just 4 years earlier, that hot seat can get your head lopped off. And don't think for a minute that that's not very immediately on the mind of James, the brother of the Lord, as Paul is prancing around the diaspora, going into synagogues, teaching that Moses is finished. James knows that his head, James, is on the chopping block here in Jerusalem. And so what James does in response for his defense, for the defense of the church there at Jerusalem, and for the defense of Christians broadly that could be subject to violent persecution for this type of teaching that Paul is engaging in, he writes the letter of James. And the letter of James, very short, has one primary overriding literary purpose. And this is part of what we're going to teach here in the coming weeks when I start walking through, and maybe I'll cover a chapter per week. I don't know. We'll see, maybe more, maybe less. But what you're going to see is that the primary overriding literary purpose of James in the letter from James that he wrote, I think, in very early AD 48 in response to this teaching that was getting a violent response from the Jews in South Galatia, has the primary purpose of establishing the continuity of Moses into the New Covenant age. Very important to grasp here to understand the book of James. Again, I'll say it again, James' primary literary purpose. And remember, he's got a lot of heat on him and he wants to get that heat off of his back. His primary literary purpose is to say to the Jewish world, first and foremost, the chief priests at Jerusalem, that our Christian movement is not saying that Moses is finished. Our Christian movement that I, James, am representing and teaching and promoting here in Judea, and therefore also in the diaspora, he's speaking for Christianity across the Roman Empire, just like Judaism at Jerusalem spoke for Judaism across the Roman Empire. James is saying, first and foremost, Moses is continuous with Jesus. It's not Jesus minus Moses, which is what Paul taught. It's in James' purview and James' teaching and his tradition that he's promoting is Jesus plus Moses. That Moses continues in full into the New Covenant age. Moses has not subsided, has not been diminished one iota, nada, Zero. It's still Moses, Torah in full. And what the book of James does is affirm that the purpose of the Messiah, Jesus, was not to get rid of Torah. The purpose of the Messiah, Jesus, is to give the ability to more perfectly do Torah. Okay? That's James. Very contrary to the teaching of Paul, right? Paul's teaching was no flesh will be justified from works of the law. That's Paul's teaching. But James' teaching was that justification is from works, that without works, there's no justification. We'll see that. That's very clear in the letter from James. So this is the distinction. This is the history. This is the milieu that's going on in AD 47 with the mission trip of Paul into South Galatia and the uprising from the Jews. That gets back to Jerusalem. That's very threatening to the church at Jerusalem, which is being led by James, the brother of the Lord. And so he writes the letter of James. And what does he do? Immediately, he launches a counter mission. And this mission, right, Paul writes about it in Galatians. He gives a very clear description of it, and as does Luke in the book of Acts. In Galatians 2, verse 12, Paul says that certain men from James, those from the circumcision, came to Antioch. Antioch in Syria. It's called Antioch on the Orontes, but it's in northeast Syria, right near the Mediterranean coast. There's a river called the Orontes River in the northeast corner of the Mediterranean Sea that goes inland, and this Antioch, which was a major center of the Roman Empire, it's basically the easternmost center of power for the Roman Empire, is about 10 miles inland on the Orontes River from the Mediterranean. So it was called Antioch on the Orontes. And so that's what they mean. If you've heard that term, Antioch on the Orontes, it means it's on the Orontes River. It's not right on the Mediterranean coast. It's on a navigable river about 10 miles inland. So James sends a counter mission to go to Antioch, which is where had become Paul and Barnabas and others, was a main center, actually the first experiment, if you will, of a church that was predominantly Gentile, that was not under the authority of a synagogue. That was at Antioch. That's why Paul and Barnabas were there ministering and teaching. They didn't make it that way. It was operating that way when Barnabas showed up, when Paul showed up. It was operating as a Gentile-led church planted by the deacons, the disciples that had been dispersed in the first wave of persecution that Paul himself was a part of, all the way back in AD 34. Remember when Stephen was martyred, he was stoned to death there outside the city gates of Jerusalem, because he taught basically the same thing, that Moses' time is over, finished. And he was telling the Jewish leaders that you're stiff-necked and resisting the Holy Spirit. And, they tore their robes and dragged Stephen outside the city gates and stoned him. And the message of Stephen's speech that you can read in Acts 7 was essentially the same message that Paul was now teaching in the synagogues in South Galatia, that the age of Moses is over. It's now Jesus. And if you resist that, the message was from Stephen, you're not resisting me, Stephen, or Paul. You're not resisting me, Paul. You're resisting God. and they tore their robes. They stoned Stephen on the streets of Jerusalem. And of course, that's about 13 years before this new wave is playing out in Jerusalem on the heels of Paul's teaching in South Galatia. Very heated, very volatile, very subject to, just like it did with Stephen in AD 34, just like it did with Paul at Lystra in AD 47, things could erupt in a minute, where one minute you think you're just having a heated discussion, the next minute they're throwing rocks at you. That's how things were. This is what James was worried about in Jerusalem as word of Paul's teaching gets back to Jerusalem. And he writes the letter of the letter of James, if you will. He writes his letter and launches this counter mission to go to Antioch and engage Paul. And if you want to call it the Paulinists, those that would hold to and also teach this same doctrine that Paul is teaching in this Gentile experiment there. And I call it experiment because it was unique in that day. In the first decade of the church, Antioch was unique as a place that had broken away from the synagogue and was operating as predominantly a Gentile-led church. It was unheard of in the ancient world of Judaism at that point. You know, we take it for granted, but you have to put yourself into the scenario of the first decade, the first 15 years of the church. It wasn't like that. To be a Gentile church broken away from the synagogue, from the Jews, was novel, and it was blasphemous. And that's the way the church at Antioch, Gentile church, the experiment that was happening only there, was viewed. And of course, Paul and Barnabas and Peter and others would take great interest. They would look at it. God is doing something there. It's not, Paul didn't plant the Gentile church. He went to Antioch and it was operating as a Gentile church. Barnabas didn't plant it. He went to Antioch and found it operating that way. This is what's going on at Antioch as James in Jerusalem launches a counter mission against the Pauline mission. He sends them to Antioch. And so Paul writes about it there that certain men from James, those from the circumcision, came and they were basically intimidating the Jews to separate from these Gentiles. And of course, Paul, who was a Jew, by the way, confronts Peter face to face and basically poked Peter in the belly. And a rare verb called katagenosko means you know better. He poked Peter in the belly with that word when he used katagenosko. He's saying, Peter, you know better than that, than to pull away from the Gentiles. And that's the scenario there suddenly at Antioch. Paul is probably, you know, it was a tough missionary journey. He was stoned and left for dead. It wasn't an easy thing to do. And moving in conflict and controversy like that is very emotionally taxing. But you have to know that Paul is coming back to Antioch after that, feeling like he's had a very successful because of God, not him, but because of God, doing the work of God and seeing these new churches planted at Derbe and Lystra and Iconium and Antioch. Still trying to think of there's a word for the region there that I'm missing. Pisidia, Antioch of Pisidia. Different than Antioch on the Orontes. Antioch of Pisidia is in what now is central Turkey. Is on the front of the land route to the front with Persia. And Antioch on the Orontes is on the front of the sea route from the Mediterranean Sea to Persia. And Antioch, the name itself goes back to the Greek empire. It's a Greek word, a Greek name that emanates out of the Greek empire. But anyways, Antioch of Pisidia is the other city in South Galatia. So Paul is back in Antioch, and the church there is probably celebrating what God has done in South Galatia to spread the gospel and to plant these new fledglings churches in South Galatia. And when suddenly this mission shows up from Jerusalem, not Galatia, Jerusalem, men from James, right? So Paul himself is tying these men who show up at Antioch to James, the brother of the Lord. And that's why you can know that they were probably carrying, it doesn't say this, but it is a very sound, from the standpoint of rhetorical logic, it's a very sound conclusion to draw that these men from James were carrying the letter from James, the letter that affirms continuity with Moses, which is diametrically opposed to what Paul was now actively teaching in the synagogues of the diaspora. And the diaspora is just a Greek term for the dispersion, where the Jews were dispersed and had set up communities in the Gentile nations. That's the diaspora. And so this counter mission shows up at Antioch, and Paul, ostensibly being a lone voice, right? Because Peter stood aloof. He even says Barnabas succumbed to this intimidation by this counter mission from Jerusalem. Barnabas succumbed to it. Paul is a lone voice there to say, you know better. And of course, Paul goes on in the letter from Galatians to, for the very first time, to put into writing his teaching, the theology of the gospel of Christ. And so the letter from Galatians is Paul's immediate response to the letter from James. So you can see these two letters. They're the very first letters written in the New Testament, represent dichotomous traditions that already exist in the church. Very important, church, 2022 church that I'm talking to here. Very important to understand that James is representing a Judaized Christianity that affirms the full continuity of Moses into the New Covenant age. At that point, included circumcision for the Gentiles. That wouldn't change until a year later at the council meeting in Jerusalem. So James, the letter from James, is affirming full continuity with Moses, and the men from James confront Paul at Antioch. The Lucan version in Acts 15, verses 1 and 2 says certain men from Judea came to Antioch teaching, listen to this, church, teaching, unless you are, this is to the Gentiles, unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. Now, it doesn't get any clearer than that. Circumcision infers the entirety of the law of Moses. When you get circumcised in the flesh, you can see where I'm pointing here. When you get circumcised in the flesh, that infers that you are a proselyte, fully committed to, fully obedient to the law of Moses. And these men from James, these men from Judea that were coming to Antioch, ostensibly carrying this letter from James, were teaching the Gentile Christians, unless you're circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you can't be saved. You are outside of the salvation plan of God. This is what they came to Antioch opposing, coming against the Pauline mission. And that's why Paul wrote Galatians. Galatians is Paul's answer to James. And there, I've written full commentaries on both Galatians and James, and there are literally dozens of what I call literary intertextual correlations between Galatians and James, to where you can know that you can know that you can know that James had a copy of, or excuse me, not James, Paul had a copy of the letter from James sitting on the desk next to him as he's writing Galatians. And he is referring to James as he's penning this letter that ostensibly to the Galatians, but it was obviously more for the purpose of answering James than it was to go to the churches at Galatia. It was both, but Galatians is Paul's answer to James. And again, you can see that in the dozens of literary intertextual correlations between Galatians and the letter from James that make it virtually indisputable that James came first and that Paul is using James to write Galatians as his answer to James. So what I want you to get out of this, church, is that the situation in the church, there in its 15th year, right? The cross was in AD 33. These two letters and the incident at Antioch are occurring in AD 48. That's only 15 years of time. So just in 15 years, the church has become dichotomous. And that means two and only two, not three or four traditions. There were two traditions in the church. There was the ancient tradition of the apostles. That's what Paul held to. That's what Paul was teaching. That's the tradition that was birthed at Jerusalem and thrived predominantly at Jerusalem up to the beheading of the apostle James in AD 43. At that point, James, the brother of the Lord, is put in charge of the church at Jerusalem. And then 4 years from there, we have this scenario exploding in the Eastern Roman Empire between Jerusalem and Antioch and South Galatia. All of this is going, and you can know that you can know that you can know there are two competing traditions, Christian traditions in the early church. Paul affirmed in Galatians that this Judaized Christianity was a legitimate form of Christianity, but he just wrote it evolved out of fear of persecution. That's in chapter 6 of Galatians. He says that you're chasing these customs of Moses, the law of Moses, out of fear of persecution. So it was out of fear of persecution from the Jews that this Judaized Christianity emerged at Jerusalem. But it did become a firm, entrenched Christian tradition. And Paul would not call it an illegitimate tradition. He affirmed it. He called it the heteros euangelion, the other euangelion, but he would not anathematize it except, and he was very clear on this when he affirmed the other euangelion. He said, except, and this is right there at the beginning of Galatians, in Galatians 1, 6, and 7, except that you would persecute and try to corrupt the full gospel of Christ. If you have a mission as a part of your tradition, other euangelion, to corrupt the full gospel of Christ, then you're no longer legitimate. You are, at that point, you are an illegitimate Christianity. And he made that clear. So he said, if you want to practice your faith by chasing Moses and works of the law, Paul, his thinking would be, you only got that faith from God. So because that faith was given to you by God, it's legitimate. What God does is not illegitimate. Paul would say, I don't anathematize what God has done. If God has given you faith to believe, you're legitimate Christians. And if you want to practice your faith by chasing Moses, Paul would say, I'm not going to deny that you're legitimate Christians, because God is the one who gives faith. God is the one who creates new. But he would say in Galatians chapter 5, right at the beginning, I think it's Galatians 5, verses 4 and 5, if you want to go look at it for yourself. Paul would say, if you want to practice your faith by doing works of the law, through circumcision, which infers the fullness of Torah and works of law, if that's how you want to practice your faith, Paul would say you are, and the preposition is horis, means apart from. You are apart from Christ. All of this is captured in that moment of time there in AD 47 and 48, and in these two letters, one from James and the response of Paul from Galatians. Two competing traditions. One is the full gospel, what Paul called the gospel of Christ. One is a Judaized gospel, what Paul called the heteros euangelion. Okay, I've taken more time than I thought I would need to take to just set the stage there at the beginning. And so in a few minutes, I'm going to try and race through 2,000 years. So let's see how this goes. So let's fast forward beyond AD 70, when Jerusalem is destroyed and the church begins to diverge away from being a Jewish-led church because of the destruction of Jerusalem and the war that the Jews had engaged against the Roman Empire, which they lost in a very tragic way with the destruction of Jerusalem. The church throughout the empire began to merge away from the Jewish influence and become a Gentile-led church. But it had, by that point, a full generation of these competing traditions. On the one hand, the Paulinists, which were primarily centered in Syria and Asia, in the Anatolian Peninsula, modern-day Turkey, and modern-day Serbia and Greece, which would be on the Balkan Peninsula. So there were two main peninsulas there. The peninsula that's present-day Turkey, which they called the Anatolian Peninsula, and that just means eastern, right? The Anatolians associated with the sunrise. So the Anatolian Peninsula is on the eastern front of the Roman Empire. That's why they call it the Anatolian Peninsula. And then the Balkan Peninsula, which is right across the Aegean Sea, that is today modern-day Serbia and Greece, be that peninsula. Those would be the centers of the Paulinists, the Paul's churches that he planted, that walked in the fullness of the gospel of Christ. And throughout the rest of the empire, which would be predominantly the Italian peninsula, right across the Adriatic Sea, you had the Italian peninsula, which would be birthed out of that Judaized Christianity. That's the Christianity that was practiced very early on in the church at Rome and took hold there, so that when the leadership transferred from the Jews, which there's a very large synagogue presence in Rome, probably about 50,000 Jews. A lot of people don't realize that, but there was a huge Jewish community, synagogue community in Rome. And the church, the Christian church at Rome, was a sect within that synagogue community under the umbrella of the synagogue Jewish authorities. That was the first generation of the church in Rome. And so when leadership transferred from the Jews to the Gentiles, the tradition that evolved and prospered at Rome, which was the center of power for the Roman Empire, the tradition in the church that evolved and developed and continued to prosper at Rome was this Judaized other evangelion, steeped in the law. Obviously, they, with the council meeting of AD 49, it became largely allegiance to the moral law of Moses because circumcision was no longer required. But it was still a form of Christianity that was very steeped in allegiance to the Ten Commandments and allegiance to the law of Moses as what? Not just that it's a good thing to do. Nobody would disagree with that. We should all affirm that the Ten Commandments are a good guideline to live our lives by. Just don't ever think that you get your righteousness from trying to do the Ten Commandments. You don't. You get your righteousness from one place only, and that's in spiritual union with the righteous one, Jesus Christ. There is no righteousness outside of him. None. Zero. We can't do anything to attain to righteousness in our flesh and our minds. All we can do is volitionally die to our sin-infected self, in which case God himself raises us up into that spiritual union with the Holy One, the righteous one, the perfect one, Jesus Christ, where we participate with him. But the Judaized form of Christianity held differently. They said, no, because of Jesus, because of who he is and what he has done and the faith we have, we can now, this is the Judaized Christianity, we can now lead sinless lives. We have, because of faith and because of ostensibly the indwelling Holy Spirit, right? They assumed everything under the guise of that near purpose of God's salvation plan. They said, because of that, we have now been given the ability to be sinless. We can still sin, but because of faith, because of the working of God, we now have the ability to not sin. It's a volitional thing. The act of obedience is to do the Ten Commandments, which we now ostensibly, this is the Judaized form of Christianity, we now have the ability to not sin. And therefore, in this life, in this world, we have the ability to represent the righteousness of God. How? By leading sinless lives in this life, in this world. That's the Judaized Christianity that emerged out of post-70 destruction of Jerusalem, synagogue-led Christianity. What emerged out of that is the Christian tradition that would hold to the idea that we can do the Ten Commandments. Now, this early church that evolved out of Judaism was very anti-Semitic. You can see that in the writings that emerged out of a big part of the church in that age, that when they moved away from the Jewish-led synagogue, they basically anathematized Judaism and made their form of Christianity the negative foil against Judaism. Judaism's bad, Christianity is good. Judaism could never satisfy God. Christianity does satisfy God in our flesh in this world through faith by the working of God to keep his commandments, to do the Ten Commandments. And so this is the Judaized form of Christianity that was seated at Rome, would become the tradition at Rome in the center of power of the ancient Christian world. The letter from James, which I want to come back to now, the letter from James basically got lost in that ancient world, right? The churches of the Balkan Peninsula and the Anatolian Peninsula, the churches that held to the teaching of Paul, they don't want anything to do with James. James is affirming continuity with Moses. And the Gentile-led Christianity that emerged at Rome didn't want anything to do with the letter from James, because they knew it was a Judaized form of Christianity, and they didn't want anything to do with being looked at as a Judaized Christianity. So the church at Rome didn't have anything to do with James. Now, there were letters that evolved out of the church at Rome. We can know First Clement. We can know the Shepherd of Hermas, which was viewed in the early church. Much of the early church, the Shepherd of Hermas was viewed as scripture. We can know that both of those documents that came out of Rome very early have strong literary parallels in the book of James. But the book of James itself disappeared. Nobody referenced it. It was just gone. The church at Rome didn't want anything to do with it because they had walked away from the Jews. They were no longer part of the synagogue. They viewed superior to the synagogue. They were superior to the Jews. They were the negative foil against Judaism. They didn't want anything to do with the letter from James. So the Paulinists didn't want them, and the church at the Judaized church at Rome didn't want James, didn't want anything to do with a Judaized aura over them. And so the letter from James was essentially lost from the church until it was revived sometime in the 3rd century. And I think the first direct reference to the book of James is in the writings of Origen. Origen is a great church leader, amazing. No time to go into it here, but one of the great church fathers of the ancient church. He got started at Alexandria and finished his teaching ministry at Caesarea Maritima in Palestine. And Origen was one of the great minds, one of the great thinkers, one of the great theologians of the early church. And he was roughly in the time frame of the first half of the 3rd century. So like roughly say 220 to 240, in that time frame is where Origen would have most of his writing and influence. And we still have a lot of Origen's writings. Origen makes, now this is 150 years after James is written. And James is essentially lost from the record of the church for 150 years. And suddenly he shows up in the writings of Origen in the first half of the 3rd century. Why? What's the dynamic that suddenly makes it okay to bring James back into the picture? And here's the picture, church. The confrontation between the two traditions, the gospel of Christ, the Pauline Johannine tradition that was practiced in Near Asia, predominantly the churches of Near Asia championed, and then the other Evangelion, which is now being championed at Rome, had played out now for over 150 years. And the Pauline Johannine tradition was receding fast. And the what at that time you can call proto-Orthodox tradition at Rome is rising to have primacy in the Roman Empire. And so because of that, they're now removed from separating themselves from the Jewish synagogue by multiple generations, by 3-4 generations by now removed, right? And we can't, tell me how much you know about your great-grandparents' life. Almost nothing. And so that would be the situation there. By the early 3rd century, the memory of all this history that transpired between these two competing traditions in the first century was faded. And for most of the church in the Roman Empire, the tradition practiced at Rome, right, the center of power, was coming to primacy, to where nobody really questioned that that's the main tradition for Christianity throughout the empire. Yes, the Pauline Johannine tradition was still being practiced, but it had been removed from the big power centers of the church, right? Alexandria, Jerusalem, Antioch, Corinth, Rome. All of these major centers of power were firmly entrenched in the Roman quasi-Judaized tradition. And they all basically felt that the God himself had passed judgment on this ancient tradition of the apostles, and that God himself had rendered judgment that this tradition at Rome was the winner in that competition. And eventually in the 4th century, with 2 church councils at Nicaea in 325 and Constantinople in 386, the ancient tradition of the apostles would be completely anathematized. In 325, the Council of Nicaea decreed the normalization of the tradition at Rome, basically the Easter tradition. The Easter tradition is the main sign of Christianity, the biggest annual celebration. And they affirmed the Roman method, means, way of celebrating Easter, which is to affirm the entire Christian tradition that was championed and fostered at Rome. That came out of the Council at Nicaea in 325, which, by the way, coincided with the rise of the first Christian empire, or emperor, Constantine. Constantine is the one that he was a champion of the Roman Catholic faith tradition. And Constantine, if anything, he had just brought the Roman Empire back together under one umbrella after being fractured for some 40 years into quadrants. Constantine brought back the Roman Empire under his authority. And so for the first time in a half a century, the Roman Empire was reunited under Constantine, and he was the first Christian emperor, and he wanted unity in his empire in the Christian realm. He was the first Christian emperor. He wanted unity, and that unity came under the banner of the church at Rome. And so one of the primary things that happened with the Council of Nicaea was the normalization. They decreed the normalization of the Easter tradition practiced at Rome. That said, throughout the Roman Empire, Christianity would observe Easter the way the Roman Church observes Easter. And the meaning there had clearly in view the ancient tradition of the apostles. They were saying that is no longer to be considered the normal way to celebrate, to observe the annual Easter holy day. The ancient tradition of the apostles was denormalized. Okay, so that's in AD 325 with the rise of the first Roman emperor, Christian Roman emperor. And then 50 years later, a little over, about 56 years later, in AD 381, there was the second, what you might call, great ecclesial gathering of the church at Constantinople, right? That's a capital city in present-day Istanbul, that Constantine moved the center of Roman power and leadership from Rome to this new city, Constantine, which today is Istanbul. And they decreed in 381, after having normalized the Roman tradition for Easter 56 years earlier, then in 381, they anathematized the other tradition. They anathematized the Easter method, means, way, the Easter sign of observing the holy days of the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. They didn't call it Easter. Easter is a Roman term. But in 381 at Constantinople, at the ecclesial council of the Catholic Orthodox Church, they anathematized, they outlawed the original tradition that Paul and John, the disciple of the Lord, championed. It was outlawed in 381. And so because of that whole movement where the tradition at Rome rose to power to the exclusion of the ancient tradition of the apostles just disappeared from the face of the church. Therefore, they could then take the letter of James, because it had roots all the way back into the earliest years of the church from the brother of the Lord himself. And the letter from James does what? It affirms their belief that Christianity, as understood through the Roman Catholic tradition, when I say Roman Catholic, I should say Catholic Orthodox. When I say Roman Catholic, you think of modern day Roman Catholics, and I don't want you to think that when I say Catholic Orthodox. This is just the one of the two traditions that governed the church in its earliest years and centuries. They called themselves Catholic Orthodoxy. Catholic meaning universal, meaning across the Roman Empire. Orthodox meaning correct teaching. So they called themselves Catholic Orthodox. And having risen to primacy to the exclusion of the ancient tradition of the apostles, Catholic Orthodoxy could now look at the letter from James and say, this letter that comes from James, the brother of the Lord, is probably the best, most explicit expression of what we believe in practice, that we can do the 10 Commandments and represent the righteousness of God in this earth, is better represented in the letter from James than it is anywhere else in the Bible. Better than any of the obviously better than the Pauline letters, because Paul said that there's no righteousness from works of the law, none. No justification. But and that, by the way, was recast through Catholic Orthodox theological lens. But the letter from James explicitly represented the faith tradition that they had, that through faith, by the working of God, by the Holy Spirit, we can do the law. We can do the 10 Commandments. And nobody represents that idea more explicitly in a written form than the letter from James. So James suddenly, there, first with Origen back in the first half of the 3rd century, James takes on a renewal, if you will, of favor in the Catholic Orthodox tradition. And so from there, it begins to make its way back into the churches. So by the end of the 4th century, you're hearing it referenced by the most prominent leaders in the Catholic Orthodox world, including at the end of the 4th century, Augustine, the famous ancient church father Augustine. So that's how James makes its way back into favor in the Catholic Orthodox world. And then from there, let's fast forward into the modern world, okay? So James basically keeps its favor all the way through up to the Protestant Reformation, and the Roman Catholic Church, the Greek Orthodox Church. They all love James because James affirms our ability to represent the righteousness of God by doing the law in this world, in our flesh, ostensibly they'll always say through faith by the working of God. We can't take credit for it, but they say that we can represent the righteousness of God in the world. Our strength, our mind, our thinking, just go out and be the righteousness of God. That's essentially the tradition that fostered through the Roman church that grew and championed proto-orthodoxy into Catholic orthodoxy, and would be the Christian tradition that would govern Western Christianity for the next 1,000 years until the Protestant Reformation. And then Luther, in modern day Germany, Luther at the right at about the year 1500, he actually started in his ministry in the late 1400s, and then gained most of his prominence there in the first quarter of the 1500s, the 16th century. Luther would basically turn on the book of James. He translated the Greek scriptures into the German tongue, and it was through that exercise that Luther saw that Paul is the champion of real, true Christian faith, and James is, he called it a right strawy epistle, a very pejorative term, basically called James a bunch of Jewish euphemisms that were slammed together very speedily, and he all but marginalized the letter from James. Now, in the preface to James, he would say some favorable things about James so that the book didn't become totally outcast in the Lutheran circles. But he was basically diminished James and elevated Paul. And so now you see the turning of the tide to where James is going to fall out of favor in the church in a growing fashion for the next couple hundred years, all the way through the 1800s and the emergence of the Tübingen school in Germany, which was very anti-Semitic, by the way. James would fall completely out of favor, and the Tübingen school, which had huge influence in the Western Christian world, would basically usher James right out the side door. They didn't remove James from the scriptures, but they certainly marginalized James. And so here again now, James is now out of favor in the church. And that raises a real problem for, say, for evangelicals, right? I'm an evangelical in the Protestant realm of the world. I believe in the inerrancy of the scriptures. So if you're evangelical, the idea that James is not on equal footing with the Pauline letters is anathema. That's a problem. If you're going to say that God introduced conflicting voices into the inerrant holy scriptures, that is a conflict that cannot be countenanced. That is anathema. And so what happened, and it really took hold in response to the Tübingen school, the German school, the Anglophone, what they call the Anglophone church, which was primarily centered in the United Kingdom. The Anglophone churches would begin to get very active to give a response to the Tübingen school in Germany. And one of the voices for that was a fellow by the name of Joseph Mayer. I want you to remember that word, very important in the whole realm of Jamesian, the study of the letter from James. Joseph B. Mayer was educated at King's College, London, and which is where Robin and I are contemplating the possibility that we may study at King's College. But Joseph B. Mayer was educated at King's College in London. He was a great voice in the Anglophone meaning the representation of Christianity that was prominently coming out of the United Kingdom, against this German continental voice that was very skeptical, very pessimistic about the origins of the New Testament documents. And, as I said, all but showed the letter from James out the side door. And so the Anglophone voice begins to rise up out of the United Kingdom to counter this movement from the continental German school, Tübingen school. And one of the primary voices for the letter from James is this gentleman by the name of Joseph B. Mayer, who writes his, I guess I'll call it his magnum opus, his greatest work, but also probably the seminal work in the realm of Jamesian studies the letter of James. He can be credited with launching a new trajectory in the study of the letter of James, which the German school had taken James and said it was a pseudepigrapha, meaning written under a false name in the first half of the 2nd century. It wasn't even written by the letter. It was not even written by James, the brother of the Lord. He just used that name to have authority and prominence. And so the letter of James was written in a particular church setting where they needed to have a strong voice representing the way that they represent. That's the German school. And very circular. If you know anything about the rhetoric of good argumentation, that's a circular argument. They said this can't be original, it has to be a late writing. So they create a scenario where it could be a late writing, and then they say because of that scenario, they say, see, it was a late writing. You see the circularity. It's a really kind of an irrational way to argue, but that's the argument that was made, and it was very influential. And so Joseph B. Mayer said, no, we don't buy that. We believe that James is one of the inspired letters in the New Testament, written very early, just like the other New Testament documents. And so Joseph B. Mayer is credited with being the first to launch a scholarly work, a scholarly perspective that brings the book of James back into this milieu that I talked about at the beginning. In the 40s, Joseph B. Mayer, writing in the 1890s, he put out his first edition in 1892 and his second edition in 1897, brought James back into the 40s. But here's what he did. Here's the circular argument of conservative evangelicalism, if you will, which he basically championed, the conservative evangelical view of inerrancy. They start with the premise that there cannot be conflicting voices in the scriptures. So yes, James and Paul sound like they're having a food fight, but they can't really be having a food fight, because that would violate our doctrine of inerrancy, because we don't believe that inerrant scriptures can carry conflicting voices. That would be anathema to the idea of inerrancy, which I don't think is true, but that's the thinking here, that the premise, if you will, the presupposition that goes into the view that brings James back into the 40s. And then he goes on to basically, almost just by decree, a propositional statement that there is no engagement, if you will, between James and Paul. Now, he never really establishes that methodologically. He never really walks you through a scenario that gets you there, that there's no contention. He just says they weren't engaging with one another. they had different reasons for writing, and so their writing sounded a little bit different, and Paul might not have been fully developed at that time, whatever the reason, but Paul and James came out of this is the conservative evangelical presupposition. Paul and James were champions of the same tradition in the early church, right? There can't be competing traditions that early in the church. There has to be one grain of truth that's still intact in the early church. And James, writing in the 40s, is in that tradition of that original, full, unadulterated gospel. And as was Paul. And so they're writing in slightly different socio-cultural contexts. And so their letters sound a little bit different, but they're not engaging with each other. And he just basically leaves it there. It's based on the idea that there cannot be conflicting voices in the church. So that's the natural conclusion. And that is basically another even more egregious form of circular argumentation. There can't be competing voices in the inerrant scriptures. Therefore, Paul and James are not arguing against each other. And they're not arguing against each other because there cannot be conflicting voices in the scriptures. See the circular argumentation here. It's very obvious in this case, much more obvious even than it was obvious enough in the case of the Tübingen school in Germany, but it's even more obvious in the conservative evangelical view that wants to take a position for the sake of inerrancy, that if you're going to bring James that early into the church, you have to just simply say that Paul and James are not engaging with each other. They're dealing with separate issues. So that then brings us through the 19th century as the Christian scholarship works its way out of the German school, which largely it has. Now, there's still a lot of that. Things don't change that rapidly in the scholarly world. They begin to change and shift, and you have tides that are moving, but you still have what I'll quote one of my favorite British scholars is Richard Bauckham. He said that the ghost of the Tübingen school form criticism still haunts the hallways of academia. You can still see it, smell it in the writing of modern academics who just can't fully, totally let go of that circular view of the New Testament documents. So it's not entirely gone. It's moving in the right direction, but not entirely gone. And one of the powerful movements in the second half of the 20th century came from E.P. Sanders and N.T. Wright, two powerhouses that reestablished the Jewish roots of Christianity, right? So for most of the church history, there was kind of a thought that Christianity was a negative foil for Judaism, and Christianity is superior and Judaism is inferior, and kind of had that anti-Semitic superiority complex through most of the church history. In the last half of the 20th century, E.P. Sanders and N.T. Wright were two of the powerhouses. There were others of a movement that reconnected Christianity with its Jewish roots and said, no, Christianity is not a foil for Judaism. Christianity was birthed out of Judaism. We owe our debt that we even exist to the Jews and Judaism and the Old Covenant and all of that. And so today we largely, in the scholarly world, we largely don't question that anymore, that the Jews are that's our roots, our heritage. We owe if nothing else, which is a huge thing in and of itself, we owe a huge debt of gratitude to the Jews. Our affections ought to be with the Jews because they have paid dearly throughout their history to be the bearers of the Hebrew scriptures and to bring forth the seed Jesus Christ. They paid a huge price in their history, just most recently, if you will, with the Holocaust in the middle of the 20th century, and now with the entire Arab world surrounding them, wanting nothing more than their annihilation. And so pray for the Jews. We owe a huge debt of gratitude to the Jews, and we should love the Jews. I love the Jews. Robin and I have visited Israel. We have toured all of Israel, and we love the people there. They're amazing people. And to go there and see the geographic and archaeological places that you read about in the Bible is just fascinating. But E.P. Sanders and N.T. Wright, two names worth knowing, worth remembering, are powerhouses in the realm of Christian scholarship that basically brought Christianity back to its Christian roots. But they made one mistake. They had one problem. They sometimes in getting out of the ditch on one side of the road, you get into the ditch on the other side of the road. Instead of coming back onto the road, you overcorrect and you end up in the ditch on the other side. And that's essentially what they did by hyper correcting. They kind of established a trajectory for Christian scholarship and Christian thinking and Christian theology that overemphasized the continuity with Moses and really brought you back into the realm significantly of the letter from James, of this hyper continuity with Moses. And the correction that E.P. Sanders and N.T. Wright brought to, and others, again, that's just two of the powerhouse names. There are actually many. In bringing us back to our Jewish roots, they overcorrected and really almost have brought us back to this hyper continuity that the Judaized Christian tradition of the first decades of the church did. And that kind of represents the situation where we're at today in this arm of Christian scholarship. And you still have Lutheranism that has accepted the correction without overcorrecting. Lutheranism largely today, after categorically rejecting its anti-Semitic roots, Lutheranism has largely come back onto the center of the road, that we do have Jewish roots. We are connected. We're not a negative foil for Judaism, but we're also not a quasi-Judaized religion. We are Jesus, 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 not Jesus plus Moses. So there's a variety of views in the modern Christian world, but in the conservative evangelical world, you still have this idea that Paul cannot be engaging in a food fight with James, and vice versa. James cannot be engaging in a food fight, theological food fight, with Paul. And that circular argument based on, you come in with a presupposition and then your conclusion matches your presupposition. That's a circular argument. That's where much of conservative evangelicalism is right now concerning the letter from James. They say, read James in and of itself alone. Do not read James as a response to Paul. And that completely, abjectly robs the church of this amazing history that I started this discussion with, of this violent conflict in the church that took place in the 40s. When you presuppositionally say that James cannot be in conflict with Paul because that would violate inerrancy, and that's what we believe, and we're not going to change our minds. That's just what we believe. James can't be in conflict with Paul, and therefore you need to study James by itself and don't make it a comparison against Pauline theology. That would be, in this circular view, a mistake. Don't do that. So part of the purpose, not part of, the overriding purpose of my entire career in PhD studies is to bring correction to that, and not to presume to correct. That is viewed harshly by too many people, but to restore the full, I guess I'll say it this way, to restore the full historical picture that took place there in the first 15 years of the church, so that we can know why James wrote his letter, and we can know why Paul wrote Galatians. And when we understand fully and accurately the context of the writers, the setting that they were in, the historical violence that was surrounding them in their early ministries, and so was really driving and motivating how they said things and why they said things the way they did. Words could get you killed in those days. And sometimes words are so nuanced and so subtle, even in their day, that it's almost completely disappears from our lenses here 2,000 years later, when we don't understand. We don't live in their situation. We can't comprehend what it's like to be them as they're penning these letters. And so my research that I'm engaged in with James, which is going to be very much embedded into the discussion of the book of James here over the coming couple of weeks, as I walk through James, say, what is James saying? Why is he saying it this way? This entire historical milieu and violence surrounding them, fear of persecution, is going to be part and parcel to that. And so my research is not to, get on a tree stump and say, I'm right, you're wrong. That would be arrogant, and I think could be pretty counterproductive. My purpose is just simply this. If we understand accurately the historical context for these letters, then we can understand accurately how to apply these letters in our modern Christian lives. And if we do the opposite, if we don't understand accurately the setting for these two letters, then we're going to misapply these letters in our modern Christian faith lives. So my motivation with the research work that I've been engaged in for many years now, and it may be many years moving forward, my mission, our mission at Legacy Bible Church, and I'm so fortunate to have Robin and several others involved with me and supportive in this mission that we have, is to restore this accurate picture of the early church, this accurate historical picture of the early church, so that we can have a restoration in the modern church of what Christianity was like in its first days. What was that original kernel of Christianity that was represented by the apostles at Jerusalem before James, the apostle James, was martyred, and was represented by the apostle Paul as he's planting churches on his 3 mission trips? What was that original, full, unadulterated kernel of truth? What was their faith walk that we're called on by Paul in 1 Corinthians 11:1 and Ephesians 5:1? We're called on, Paul said, be imitators of me, become imitators of me. And then in Ephesians, become imitators of God. What does that look like? What does it mean to become an imitator of God? And we can only get there as our starting point to understand the authors themselves fully in their context. And that's the mission of Legacy Bible Church. Understand the original context, and then let's become everything that they called on us to become in their letters. Let's become that in the modern church. So we love you, church. This got a little longer than I was expecting that it would be, but this is the foundation now for this walk that we're going to do through the book of James. You now have the umbrella of 2,000 years of what I call a conundrum of traditions relative to the letter of James, where it started, how it ebbed and tide through history, and where we are today with the letter of James. And with this foundation, we'll talk about the letter of James. So God bless you. We'll be back on Wednesday with the chat time with Sarah, and we'll see you back here with the teaching in James in 2 weeks. We'll see you. We love you, church. We'll see you then.